And I remember when I was reading condolence letters in the Kennedy Library, coming across a letter from someone who said, "A man like this comes along once in a century." And it seems, I suppose I'm revealing my hand to say that I believe that historians may one day say that about Barack Obama, who really, I believe, has been a very remarkable president in a very, very difficult time. We're so involved in the current moment that it's hard to get the distance to imagine how he might be evaluated outside of all of the tensions and agonies of our current historical period.
We have a great panel today for our Politics of Hope. 4 historians take on the Obama presidency. I've known Barack since we were 1Ls at Harvard Law School in September 1988. He had taken a few years off before law school. I had come in fresh from college. He and I were both members of the great Section 3, which is a quintessential paper chase class. And Barack, even at the time, exhibited something special. And it's interesting, my take, and it'll be good to hear what the historians have to say, is that at the end of the day, Barack is a lawyer, and I'm speaking as a lawyer. And maybe this is sort of a positive aspect. I think lawyers as being rational, reasonable advocates for their positions. And Barack was always a very thoughtful, articulate human. He and I was college Republican president, so he and I would differ from time to time on issues, but he was never strident. He was never, taking it to a level of discourse that would be, rude or, uninformative. And I think all of us in the class, Republican and Democrat, have always held Barack in the highest regard. And when people would ask me, because they know I was college Republican president, they'd say, is he a crazy, foreign-born guy who's out to kill the U.S.? And I say, at the end of the day, he's a lawyer's lawyer. He's a scholar. Whether that has served him well as president is to be seen. But I will say, whenever a classmate of yours is president of the United States, we all sort of dim in comparison.
And David, you mentioned this, but let's acknowledge the elephant in the room, that we're going to attempt to have a conversation about the legacy of the current president, who will be our president all the way until January 20th of next year, regardless of what happens on Tuesday. But we're also in the midst of a historic election as well. So I want to be perfectly honest. I don't know how we keep the current election out of this conversation. We'll probably get to it without a doubt. But first, about the legacy of President Obama and his presidency overall, I'd like to just start with the fact of the man himself. Obviously, America's first African-American president, elected twice. And just want to again, I'm not going to necessarily throw specific questions to any of you unless it pops up, but I just wanted to open with that idea as well. What's the obvious import of the fact of the man himself in terms of American history and what his presidency means?
Well, as you said, the obvious thing is that he's the first African-American president, and it was a hugely symbolic thing for the United States to do that after the country's history with race. There are a number of people, I have to say this is something that I never thought that I would see in my lifetime. I never thought it would be, and if it did happen, it would not be from the Democratic side. There was a notion of a type of safe African-American person who could be president, a Colin Powell type, a military type, people, it was sort of an article of faith that it would have to be somebody from that area of American life. And here we have this person named Barack Obama, a community organizer who it was an amazing statement about America, and the world certainly saw it as American. I remember one headline saying something like, they did it, as if it was some question about whether or not we could do it. So it's important for the presidency, but it's important symbolically in ways that whatever we think about about his policies, the fact that he was in that particular place says a lot about the nation, how far the nation has come. You know, for some people, in a good way, but I think as we see now, maybe for other people, it was exactly the opposite of what they wanted to see.
And I agree with what Annette says entirely. I think it's also worth remembering that when Obama ran in 2008, he really did not emphasize racial issues much at all. Until it really became an issue. Either his church with the Reverend Wright became a controversy, and certain other moments where he addressed it head on. But his method or his belief was that he wanted to keep those issues secondary. And in the past, when African American candidates had run for president, had run as sort of the black candidate, they had been pigeonholed and sort of it had sort of limited their appeal. Maybe they had limited appeal for other reasons too, but it had been a constraining influence. But I think the problem for Obama then when he got to be president was he hadn't, neither he nor the country was prepared for this backlash, for incidents like the Trayvon Martin shooting in Florida, where when he addresses it in a press conference, it becomes a controversy. Or even when Professor Gates at Harvard is arrested for trying to get into his own house, and Obama addresses it at a press conference, it becomes a controversy. That those things weren't foreseen by the kind of campaign that was run in 2008.
Yeah, the president could not describe the actions of a police officer as foolish. A black president, it was as if the white police officer had more currency than he did, or yelling, "You lie," out in the middle of a...
Right.
So that kind of thing, people had not anticipated what this would mean.
I can't wait to read the Obama memoir, presidential memoir, which I expect, most of these presidential memoirs be really remarkable. It's been said of at least one other president that he had a first-class temperament, and I would, whatever issues we may cover today in our discussion about race and the other elements of that have impacted this moment, I do think that that President Obama has that. And I remember when I was reading condolence letters in the Kennedy Library, coming across a letter from someone who said, "A man like this comes along once in a century." And it seems, I suppose I'm revealing my hand to say that I believe that historians may one day say that about Barack Obama, who really, I believe, has been a very remarkable president in a very, very difficult time. We're so involved in the current moment that it's hard to get the distance to imagine how he might be evaluated outside of all of the tensions and agonies of our current historical period.
Well, this may sound counterintuitive, but it seems to me in many ways that Barack Obama was our fourth great Republican president. In that, and I think this speaks to what Annette was saying, that he worked very hard to position himself, much as Lincoln had done and as Teddy Roosevelt had done, as a president for the entire population, beginning with increasing equality of opportunity for people at the bottom, and therefore supporting a stronger middle class and paying much less attention to the people at the top, the same way that Lincoln and Roosevelt had done. And his rhetoric was really stunningly like Roosevelt's, Teddy Roosevelt's, not FDR's. And I think the problem with that is he assumed that that was the kind of language that Republicans could get behind because it was, after all, originally theirs. And he ran into a brick wall when he ran into the modern-day Republican Party, which is not a real Republican Party any longer. And it's going to be interesting to see how these parties now shake out, because the language that had been so effective for Lincoln, Roosevelt, and Eisenhower is now sort of owned by Barack Obama. And we'll see where it goes.
So let's stay with this question of race for a moment, because isn't one of the inadvertent legacies of President Obama that he was, as we've been discussing, he was heralded as the president who's supposed to represent a post-racial America, but in the context of his presidency, America proved itself to be anything but post-racial. I mean, for David, all the examples that you raised, and I can't even remember how many times the president, especially over the past couple of years, has had to speak at funerals for people who have been killed, and whether it be by law enforcement or the law enforcement officers who've been killed, but just the concept that he had come into office. I mean, we're calling it the politics of hope, as this great hope that America was going to move itself into the 21st century as a more united nation. We end up 8 years later feeling far less united, not because of President Obama, and necessarily his policies, which we'll discuss, but just the fact that having an African American in the White House has shown racial divides are as deep as ever in this country.
I mean, I, for one, never bought into the post-racial rhetoric. I mean, people said that a lot. I sort of thought of Obama's election a little bit like the movie Blazing Saddles, where these racist sort of whites out in this western town were happy to have this black sheriff come in because they were so desperate they wanted someone to clean up the mess, but there was still plenty of racism there. And then that comes out, and then maybe in Blazing Saddles he wins them over in the end. And I think Obama has won over a lot of people, but clearly not all. But that, I thought the post-racial was kind of a media construct. It was nice to believe in and to sort of want us to think that. I mean, it certainly is a dramatic, symbolic, moment to elect a black president, but I think most of us knew that in and of itself, it didn't spell the end of racism.
Well, there's that, but there's also I guess it's the Irish Tammany in me that says there was a certain realpolitik that's in this story as well, about how decades of struggle and the civil rights movement, the pressure from women, from radicals, from racial minorities who changed the Democratic Party and overthrew really an old machine-style politics that made someone like Barack Obama possible, who rose up through the Democratic Party. And I remember being on a panel like this when Obama was first elected. Something to the effect that if at the end of Obama's presidency, the most important thing that's said about him is that he was our first African American president, he will have been a failure. I completely disagreed with that in that moment, and I disagree with it now, because I think it's a denial. He certainly has done much more than that, but it's a denial of what that represented in the history of our country and what Obama has had to deal with over the past 8 years. The other side of it is that he was elected and reelected. So that is significant in terms of where we've moved as a country. It's easy to see the glasses as half empty, but there's this other portion of it as well.
Well, I feel like in many ways we're replaying Reconstruction, in that we started with a president who, both in the Civil War but also with Barack Obama, who wanted to use the federal government to expand equality of opportunity. And it worked extraordinarily well in the 1860s. And the problem with that, of course, is that it cost tax dollars. And after the Civil War, when the federal government helped ex-slaves to try and get a foothold into the free labor economy, racists, especially Southern Democrats, came back with the construct that an activist government, by definition, was simply a way to redistribute wealth from hardworking white people to lazy minorities, lazy African Americans in that case. And the resonance of that formula, the same formula that really has propelled the modern-day Republican Party, when they took a look at Barack Obama as the actual Democratic president, they went into hyperdrive. We get the Tea Party. We get the idea that the man is a socialist. I actually worked on my last book because I thought, he's a socialist? Like, there's 2 of them left in the world and one of them became president? How did that happen? But it wasn't the reality of anything he was doing. It was the idea that an African American in control of the government, with a program that called for a government to expand opportunity through programs that would help people at the bottom of the scale, was by definition a communist who was going to destroy white America through taxation. And that is directly out of the period from 1866 to 1872. It resonated in America, and it has come back on a couple of occasions, but right now it was incredibly powerful once you got an African American in the White House. And that, I think, is part of the significance of both his approach, his in a sense, post-racial or pre-racial approach, and the backlash against it as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're exactly right as a form of backlash. And to think of Reconstruction, with an emphasis on the notion of concern about the loss of white power. There have been times when whites have not minded the redistribution of government goods and services to white people. That hasn't, that's not the only thing. The question is, as I was alluded to in my first comments, the idea that an African American person could have power, wield power over whites. Even before he was elected, there was, he's King Obama. Before he'd done anything at all, this notion of black rule, the fear about black rule, which is very much a Reconstruction construct. I mean, that was driving them. These are people who had been used to using African Americans as property or viewing them as property. All of a sudden, this property now can vote and can be a representative, and that just drove people crazy. So economics definitely plays a part of it, but there's this other thing, this other feeling that the sense that blacks cannot exercise control, should not be allowed to exercise control over whites, is very, very pertinent, and symbolically he's up there, being the sort of fears that people have had for always.
Well, and the next thing you do is you take away people's. Absolutely no accident there. Because they don't understand how the government's supposed to work.
And not even you want to compete for these people's votes. You want to, because they could have competed for people's votes. The idea is you just stop them from voting altogether and take things back as near to slavery or debt peonage after the end of the war as it could be.
And here we are nearly 150 years later dealing with voter suppression. In the United States, the courts are ruling now, this week, on voter suppression.
North Carolina had the most recent state ruling, yeah. So, I mean, there's this there's a conventional wisdom that any particular election is in part a referendum on the leadership that's exiting. Let's just accept that conventional wisdom for a moment. We could debate it, but let's accept it. Given that, what does it say that through the course of the Republican primaries, that the Republican Party and its voters have put up Donald Trump as their nominee? If we, given the idea that it's a referendum again on the presidency of Barack Obama. I mean, because we can talk about Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton as nominees, but what about Donald Trump as the Republicans' best choice, if we accept what the primaries are supposed to provide, following an Obama presidency?
Well, I mean, Trump emerged as a political figure, if we want to call it that. A response, the backlash was the word Annette used, to an African American having power and as well as his agenda. So the questioning his legitimacy in terms of his citizenship, in terms of his origins, is he even American? Also questions about his religion play into it too. Is directly on this question we've been discussing so far. The other thing, though, I think about Trump that he has identified is a split within the Republican Party between what we might reduce to internationalist versus nationalist, populist versus elitist, globalist versus anti-globalist, and that for all the sort of continuities we can see in Trump's cultural populism going back to, I'd say, the Nixon administration, what I see as different here is the rejection of this longstanding Republican base of finance and business. We sort of saw the early signs of this in 2008 with the TARP, where George W. Bush and Henry Paulson put forward this bailout plan, and it's rejected by the House Republicans. And even though it's a very Republican plan, they end up passing it with Barney Frank and Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats. So you start to see these fissures in the Republican Party over these issues of finance, trade, immigration, obviously. And that is, I think, where Trump, unlike most of the other top Republican contenders, was doing something different from where the Republican Party has been.
These were the people, he's representing people who had been a part of the party, but had been, in some ways, they would say, taken for granted
Right.
by the, do whatever you want to do, but don't do it with my money type Republicans. Social issues, cultural issues, the feeling of being disfranchised and so forth, well, not literally, but that they didn't matter. He's speaking to those people. And also, I would have to say, back to the question of race, which has always been a problem for the Republican Party that's been sort of hidden away from that, in a much more open way, they felt free to actually bring those things to the fore and to say things that would never have been said before, to accept people who would never be accepted, in sort of publicly into the tent. They were just sort of patted on the head and kept over. And now he speaks to these people. He's given them power.
And there's a moment in the primaries where you saw a potentially different future for the Republican Party. Marco Rubio had just, I forget if he won South Carolina, or he had won or done very well in one of his primaries, and he and Nikki Haley and Tim Scott were kind of all up there in this sort of multicultural tableau, still preaching a certain conservatism, but it was not Trump's angry populism. It was a more forward, positive vision that seemed to want to adjust to and recognize America's changing racial demographic and so on. But most of the Republican Party chose to reject that vision, at least for now. And so the question is whether there is a possibility of the Republican Party reconciling itself to a multicultural America.
And also, I would say, just to add, talking about these people, even though they talked about the field as really great, a wonderful field, it was not so great. I don't think it was so great. Person who had been on television 14 seasons on a television show saying you're fired, exuding authority and power and competence, certainly with edited tapes or whatever, and a rigged thing to make it seem that he's an authority, to come up against that with these particular candidates. I don't know. There's got to be somebody out there, other people out there who would have done a better job of dealing with this. Maybe I'm wrong, but I never, this sort of saying we have the strongest field that we've ever had, I don't know that he was really up against the best that they had.
The best field. I'm afraid I agree with that. And I put the problems in the Republican Party way earlier than 2008 or than Nixon or anything. I think the Republican Party never recovered from the New Deal in the sense that, the party split right then. You got, on one hand, the Dewey and Eisenhower Republicans who adjusted the New Deal to make it look a lot more like a Roosevelt vision, for example, that put more emphasis on business than perhaps FDR had. But very early on, you got a rump group of Republicans who began to call themselves movement conservatives, who insisted that you needed to take the country back to the days before the New Deal. And by 1960, they were talking about taking the country back to the days before the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And I'm not joking. That's actually, if you wanted to see the documents, you could. But they really didn't get traction. They wanted to kill business regulation, and they wanted to kill social welfare legislation because they didn't like the taxes in it. But they didn't get traction until they were able to link in, as I say, to that whole Reconstruction idea that somehow an activist government would redistribute wealth from hardworking white people to lazy African Americans. And Brown v. Board in 1954 gave that to them. And when Eisenhower sent the troops to Little Rock in 1957, they literally, William F. Buckley Jr. had started the National Review in '55, and he literally hired an editor whose job was to hammer on racism, to say a government that regulates business and provides social welfare is going to take white tax dollars and give it to lazy people, and those lazy people are going to be black. And that argument began to gather steam, of course, with Goldwater, who takes 5 deep South states. Nixon then turns to the Southern strategy. Reagan rides that to power with the welfare queen. It begins to gain power in the Republican Party until Newt Gingrich and his revolutionaries take over the House in '94. And when they do that, they clean rhinos out of the party. But those rhinos were the Eisenhower and the Dewey guys who were originally the heart of the party. And that, I think, when you look at who we had on the stage during the Republican convention, they were all movement conservatives. There was not an idea there other than let's slash the government, let's slash social welfare, let's get rid of business regulation. And because they had to bring evangelicals on board during the Reagan administration because they didn't have enough votes, there were people like, Cruz, who wanted to bring back, create America as a Christian nation. But they are a fringe group. The liberal consensus from the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s took the vast majority of both Democratic and Republican Americans, and they all believed that the government had a role to play in government regulation of the economy and in providing basic social welfare. Most Americans believe that, I think, and the current Republican Party does not do that.
Well,
And
can I
that's
just
what we've
jump
got
back?
reflecting.
Go ahead, Ellen.
I think in terms of your question about Trump as a response to the Obama administration and whatever its legacy is understood, that's complicated. In some ways, I think Trump is sui generis. He certainly, falls along these historical lines that my colleagues here have been describing, and in some ways represents emerged out of a shift in the Republican Party towards this kind of extremism. And on the other hand, he captured the party. He hijacked the party in a way that none of them predicted that he would be able to do. It seems to me that, so in that sense, I think he certainly is trading on the continued feelings of some particularly white Americans who, by the way, the social scientists say are not poor people. They actually are doing reasonably well in this economy. But they have concerns, obviously. There are difficult social and economic issues facing the country. But the bizarre thing is that it's so much not a response to the Obama administration, in that the economy has recovered in many ways. The job situation has improved. Yes, there are people that are still struggling. The Obamacare is imperfect in its execution, as was, by the way, Social Security, a program that took decades to straighten out, and even now has its difficulties. So it seems to me less a response to the realities of what has occurred over the last 8 years than it is to some changes within the Republican Party and the emergence of this kind of extremism, and finally, the role of media in presidential politics. In some ways, I see Trump as the logical conclusion of a process that began in 1960 when television became a major variable in our national politics.
And he uses media brilliantly.
Yeah.
I mean, he's understood that he didn't have to spend any money to be on television. I travel a lot, and going through airports, he is always there. either they're waiting for him to come and talking about them waiting for him to come, or they're showing him there, or they're talking about the aftermath as if having been there. I mean, it's just wall-to-wall coverage, and he knows how to tweet. He understands Twitter. He knows how to turn phrases in ways. He has adapted himself wonderfully to the new media in a way that's made him enormously effective without having to do the traditional kinds of things that you think candidates have to do.
David, go
Yeah,
ahead.
I just wanted to say just a word on the question of Trump and the conservative movement. If you talk to people who identify as movement conservatives, this kind of the ideology is more important than the Republican Party, that, you know, kind of since Goldwater, they reject the notion that Trump is one of them at all. And so although, yes, we can say Trump is more extreme than Mitt Romney and then other Republican nominees, but it's also, I think, important to understand it along different vectors from just more right-wing or more part of that conservative movement. It has a lot to do, I think, with this, you know, populism is the word that people have often been using. It's not a perfect fit, but that the almost uniform hostility of the Republican establishment, most of whom do see themselves as leaders of the conservative movement, you know, people like Paul Ryan, to Trump, is I think what's really new here, and that the party hasn't sort of fully wrestled with and digested.
Yeah. So let me ask you, I mean, some things that all of you have said make me wonder. Or I don't want to say was, because he's still the president, but is Barack Obama's presidency something of an anomaly? Did I turn this off? Sorry. Told you I have terrible mic technique. Is Barack Obama's presidency something of an anomaly, given the long-term, the sort of long-term historical trends? My apologies. Given the long-term historical trends, given how the Republican Party itself is changing, how perhaps even the Democratic.
I don't know that we. Yeah, every president has to be judged by the context of his or her time. I wouldn't say that we will never see another black president in another 100 years, or generation, or however you want to define it, but I do think it's going to be tougher. I think we're probably in for a really rough time, whatever happens on Tuesday, because forces have been unleashed, things are out in the open, declarations have been made that are pretty frightening in a lot of ways. So it's going to be a quite contentious time. I do think that the circumstances were ripe for this. We had this terrible disillusionment, concern about the war, the Iraq War, the economic situation, the economic meltdown. Young people were not able to get jobs. People were frightened in general. And I do think Blazing Saddles, which, by the way, I think tells you just about everything you need to know about race relations in America. It's a good primer for that. I think there was an element of that. We're voting for this person because we're, give it a shot, give him a shot.
Right.
And you get an extra dose of feel good too. We're doing this thing and we can do this. And that was a particular moment of being frightened where he could come in, and he is the consummate lawyer. He is someone who presents himself as rational and reasonable. He was not, as I said before, I thought it had to be a military person, but he has as close to that persona as anybody could be without actually being that. And I think he was of his time. He's definitely of his time. And I don't know that moment, I don't know when that moment is going to come back now, where somebody like him or anybody close to being like him could actually take office.
One of the things that he ran on was this idea that he would not be caught up in this, this incredible animosity between the political parties, and the idea of hope in part was that we could overcome our differences and work together towards common goals. And what's amazing about the current situation is that Mr. Trump is arguing in terms of the Obama record, that the country is in terrible shape, worst president, quote, in American history. That's quite a statement considering the competition. So, worst president in American history, America's in decline, you know, this whole portrait of our country, and that he's accomplished nothing except things that are destructive, but there doesn't seem to be any linkage to the fact that the kind of opposition that he faced and the difficulty he had in getting traction in working with Republicans to advance legislative goals, and the decision that some of the Republican leadership and their followers made to try to prevent him from achieving the goals that he set out. So he's being blamed for the gridlock that he was elected in part for this posture, which was genuine, it wasn't a posture, is his commitment to trying to overcome.
The rhetoric, I mean, I think Heather's right. The rhetoric he has always used of the common good that does harken back to Theodore Roosevelt and the progressive era, was on display from his very first famous speech in 2004. Not a red and a blue America, but we're all one America. And I think the great irony of his presidency, although I think on the whole he's been a very successful presidency, is that most of his successes have been almost entirely partisan. It's been stuff he's either done with Democrats only, like Obamacare, or through executive action, not using the Congress. A lot of that clearly is because of this obstructionism that was the Republicans' game plan. But I think that to some degree, some smaller portion of that can perhaps be laid at his feet. I think our most successful presidents who did not have control of the Congress in their own party, I think Bill Clinton did this, I think Reagan and Eisenhower did this, were able to see, well, what does the other party want that I can in good faith sign on to and work in a compromise way. So one day you pass something with all Democrats, and then the next day, the next month, you say, well, here's something I can pass with a third of the Democratic Party and 2/3 of the Republican Party. And I think Obama occasionally was able to do that, but for the most part could not see his way clear. And again, I would put most of this on Mitch McConnell and the Republicans, but some of it also on Obama. Didn't have the inside Washington skills or whatever it was to be able to pivot and work as a different kind of president, especially once he lost the House.
I don't know. Just a little bit of pushback on that. I don't know what he could have done more to actually. I know a lot of people said presidents have to schmooze, they have to do things, and he's not like that. He's too cool and cerebral. He doesn't do it. But I mean, the level of obstruction, the level of contempt that he had to face. The sense that people get seen with him, cooperating with him, get killed by their constituency. I mean, there were some really strong lines in the sand drawn by Republicans and voters who did not want him to cooperate with them. So I agree. It could well be that he didn't find the magic key, but it's a really, really tough thing to do, given the position he was in when he came into office. And the Republicans say, my number one job is to prevent him from being reelected. Not my number one job is to serve my people or to do things. It's that is a goal. Gee, I really don't know what to do if people don't, if that's the attitude that people have. And a lot of, I should say also, Democrats believe that he compromised too much, that he also gave away things even before people asked, trying to
compromise, because that's what politicians do, except you can't compromise when the other side just says, no, we're not going to do anything.
I think if you step back,
the Supreme Court.
If you step back a little bit from this and look at the longer arc, like it or not, the Affordable Care Act is the most important piece of social welfare legislation passed by the Congress since Social Security. Now, that isn't to say that there aren't problems with it, but in its sweep, there is nothing, I don't think, that is equivalent to what it attempted to do. Millions of people have health insurance as a result of this. And it's part of a much longer history and story about attempting to provide what most Western democratic industrialized nations provided, universal or near universal health care to our citizens. We're far from there yet, but in the longer arc of history, that part of the story will be seen as very significant, I think.
In terms of whether or not he is an anomaly, I have 2 points. The first is it has to be said, for all of us here on the panel, can we give a hand to the man who did not give us a scandal? I mean, you know. True. But I actually think it could be that this looks again very much to me like the late 19th century when the arc of, and this, he said he was like trying to turn an ocean liner, when the arc of politics changed and the person who did it didn't get credit in the 19th century and nobody cares about him anymore, but it was Grover Cleveland. And that change matters over time, and if that change takes off, and I think it will today, because today is today, and I might think differently on Wednesday, because women are voting now. The gender voting gap right now, as the last I checked a couple days ago, is 28 points. That makes a big difference in the way things go. Whether or not this is going to continue, I would say yes, if you could limit it to the walls of America. I think the wild cards right now are the fact that we are now in an international economy and an international politic, and we also have the problem of cyber warfare. Right. And the stuff that's coming out now about what happened with the Brexit vote and what's happened with some of the other European votes thanks to cyber warfare seems to me to be deeply troubling for America. And it's a little hard to think about the future without realizing that we have a monkey wrench in it.
Well, let me ask you all a couple of questions about, since you brought up the Affordable Care Act, maybe some more challenging aspects of what President Obama's legacy may be. And first of all, let's talk a little bit about the economy, because you mentioned, yes, overall, the economy has recovered. But I'm thinking, given the rise of the candidacy of Bernie Sanders, making an appeal on the Democratic side to many people who feel as if they have not enjoyed the fruits of that economic recovery, and even looking at some of the numbers that, yes, even though the recovery has happened, the vast majority of that recovery has been enjoyed by the few people at the very top of the income scale. I just wonder, it wasn't President Obama who brought us the 2008 financial crisis. It was handed to him when he entered the White House. But I think there is some debate to be said over how over his leadership in terms of could we have even enjoyed a deeper recovery, a recovery that actually touched the lives of more people at the middle and the bottom end of the income scale? Was there more that he could have done, even given GOP obstruction, to do that?
I don't know how with this Republican Congress that would have occurred. I really don't. I think it's just sort of hard for me to imagine that was the case. And I also think that this is a product of much broader changes that are occurring in our economy and in our society. We have a candidate today who is going to Midwestern Rust Belt cities saying that we're going to bring these, high-wage industrial jobs back to America. We're going back to the future, there's not words to describe this if you're a historian and you've studied the evolution of our country into a post-industrial age. So that strikes me as highly irresponsible given the realities of what has happened in the world economy and the United States' place within that.
Yeah, I'm skeptical that the issues, say, that Sanders raises, particularly about inequality, are that amenable to policy in the way that, policy can address something like health insurance and so on. That some of these are
really, but it's policy that helped drive that inequality, though.
I
Someone
think
decides who gets taxed and how much.
Right, but even if we had a much more progressive tax code, the issues, the drivers of inequality have to do with much deeper structural forces. We could go back to sort of pre-Reagan era tax levels, and you would still have the same problem with widening inequality. So I'm not sure, and I do think that we probably will have to move, and I think if Clinton is elected, she wants to move the country toward more progressive taxation, but that's only going to get us maybe a tenth of the way there. I mean, it has much more to do with sort of the rise of finance and many other deeper structural factors in the economy.
Well, I take your point, but the rise of finance in part aided by deregulation, by financial deregulation, also instruments of policy. So
all of these things that the Republican Congress is very much in support of, including measures that might very well deepen some of these difficulties, the privatization of Social Security being one.
And of course, Glass-Steagall is under the Clinton administration, right?
Right, but I think most economists now say that Glass-Steagall really would have done very little to prevent this recession. Yeah, that we can try to introduce more restrictions on what banks can and cannot do that might prevent another, catastrophe like the 2008 crash, but to the underlying drivers of what is creating kind of a super rich class versus other people, experiencing either modest or little growth, that's not a function of policy.
I'm afraid I would disagree with that. It seems like we're talking about two separate things. We have the world economy, which is doing its own thing, and then we have the way people respond to that, which is policy. And we have no choice but to respond to the world economy. But the way you respond to it is by electing people who put in policies that you feel are going to, obviously if all we did was that you feel are going to expand our equality of opportunity, if all we do is increase taxes, no, that doesn't do anything. But what do we do with the tax dollars? What that says has a lot to do with decreasing that inequality. And I think economists have pointed to that pretty clearly with how we've had this great divergence since 1980, and the compression from the New Deal to 1980 has really been reversed because of
So another question, and maybe it's just because I'm in the world of journalism and media, that this aspect of the president's legacy, I'm not sure what I think. His relationship with the press has been off and on. It's been rather fraught. His presidency has actually proven that in the modern age with technology, you don't even necessarily need the quote-unquote mainstream media at all, right? I will give the Obama administration and his campaigns full credit for doing basically effective runarounds, and being their own source of media and journalism and coverage. But on the other hand, is there something to be said that we had a president for 8 years who didn't necessarily love doing press conferences, and who at the same time, in terms of the public's access to information, put enormous numbers of documents, made them classified, who used the Espionage Act with his attorney general on reporters more than many other previous presidents? I think that there is something of a fraught relationship there. And David, you've done a lot of scholarship on administration's relationship with the media, and I was just wondering what you think about that.
Well, I think reporters certainly talk and seem to believe that Obama is the most restrictive president they can remember. The thing is, as a historian, I look back, I see this said about almost every president. It was said about Johnson, then it was said about Nixon, and so on. And I think on the Espionage Act, you're absolutely correct. And I think Obama, it really is an act that has barely been used until this administration. I think maybe Bush started to use it a little bit, but was kind of a dead letter. So on that, yes, but the press conferences, the message discipline, this was all stuff that we saw under Bush as well. And to some degree under Clinton, when presidents are down, they withdraw and they get hostile to the press. And when they're up, it's much easier to be open. I do think that presidents are struggling in a new media environment because of the internet, the proliferation of alternate news sources, alternate cable channels, so that although Obama as a campaigner was able to mobilize people behind himself and a campaign, that's much easier to do than to mobilize people behind something like the Affordable Care Act. And that people seemed disappointed with him, that he seemed to have lost his kind of magic with mobilizing the public. But I think it was really that his popularity was tied to the economic conditions, and that so long as things were pretty bleak in those early years of his presidency, his popularity lagged. And now things are getting better. He's getting more popular again. I think he's also getting more popular again because of Trump, that sort of the contrast is being drawn more sharply. But people aren't complaining about his media accessibility so much anymore because he's up.
And they don't have anybody to appeal to because he's always there. I mean, it's to the public. He doesn't seem inaccessible. He's every place all the time. Twitter, other kinds of social media, television, which he uses, the entertainment world that he uses very, very well, effectively. Both he and his wife, the First Lady, is incredibly important to this whole story, and in some ways is just as historic a figure as he is. And so they are able to present this front present themselves in ways that other presidents hadn't. He's just at the peak, maybe not the peak of it, but it's certainly a media environment with the social media that hasn't really existed even before, even with Bush.
I think that the days are just over when we're going to have a kind of, sort of sense of a collective sense of a unified American people lionizing their president. And we have the combination of the lack of reverence for the office, which we could date at least to the Vietnam War and then to Watergate and the subsequent developments, and the impact of the current media environment. If Kennedy was our first television president, he had all of the benefits and none of the downside of media coverage. That is, very good on television, but operating in an environment in which things that have subsequently emerged about his presidency would never have been reported on at that time, his private life, his health, and so forth. And now we have a president who in the morning gives a press conference, and by 6 p.m., there have already been hours of cable television shows, radio programs, highly partisan, tearing apart every single aspect of this and, rendering nil any kind of collective assessment of it. So this is feeding these divisions. It's great to have a engaged and critical citizenry, of course, but the way in which modern mass media actually literally survives on needs. There's advertising that's being sold. These networks are staying on the air. They're getting audiences by fanning these divisions. And any president in that environment, I think they feel embattled, and one can understand why. And it's eroding any sense of collective, I think, approval in some way among the public at large.
Man, am I turning into Pollyanna down here? Yeah. I study the Republicans. I'm supposed to be on the floor in tears. I don't know, the one thing that we don't grapple with as well as we should, I think, is the extraordinary changing demographic in America. Millennials outnumbered baby boomers a year ago, August. They use media entirely differently than my generation does, and I don't think they care so much about the scandals that drive cable news. They don't watch TV. They certainly don't follow media people. They follow thinkers, individual thinkers. And I am not a media scholar, and I am not under 50, so I don't know how that's going to play out. Yeah. But I'm not convinced that we're all going to splinter and we're all going to end up hating each other. In fact, it almost seems to me like one of our problems has been since the 1960s that political parties have focused on political science and the slicing and dicing of the electorate. And one of the things that both Trump and Sanders offered, although they offered them in very different ways, was a narrative behind which people could line up that made them feel like they were important to America, to one vision of America or another. And it seems almost to me like that pendulum is switching, and we'll go back to narratives where people say, I don't care what this person is doing in their private time, but I want an America, I want to be part of an America that looks like this. And
That's different than governing, though, don't you think, Heather? I mean, it's one thing being a candidate and standing in front of a rally of 10,000 people and talking a particular line and engaging people. It's another thing to be in the White House trying to govern in this environment. I don't know.
it's a question, I think, of how powerful a candidate can pull along a party or not.
Yeah, not so good, I would say, lately.
Not right now, but you know, I'm playing Pollyanna over here. Give me 5 years.
Someone needs to do it. It's a dirty job.
Well, I just have one more question for all of you, and while we're discussing it, I'm happy to have folks who would like to ask a question of our phenomenal panel here to begin to line up. I will give you your gentle reminder about time limits after we wrap up our portion of the conversation. But, I mean, to me, part of President Obama's legacy, and I'm just speaking personally as a citizen, not as a journalist or a moderator, but I felt inspired by his championing of civility and decency. Mm-hmm. And I think that is in short supply in America right now. And with that in mind, I was thinking so much of what we lay people, not necessarily historians, but lay people look to when we think about great presidents of the past was their ability to speak to America in a way that captures the values of the moment that they're in. So I guess what I'm saying is the power of political oratory. Mm-hmm. And we have 2 nominees right now who, even given Donald Trump's, genius on Twitter, neither Trump nor Hillary Clinton have that same power, I think, of political oratory that matters in terms of mobilizing and inspiring people across party lines. So I'm just wondering, I mean, I've shown my hand here, but from your perspective as historians, how much is how Barack Obama talked about American politics going to be part of his long-term legacy?
Well, in this book I've written, Republic of Spin, I talk about oratory, but also kind of media use in general as it's evolved since Theodore Roosevelt. One of the things I came to see is that there's a popular notion that people who were great communicators are remembered as great presidents. But that's actually not really the case. There were many people who were initially regarded as great communicators, and you can go back and look at them. Herbert Hoover, Jimmy Carter were hailed as media geniuses until their presidencies turned out to be policy failures, and then their so-called media skills were not well remembered. Those who are remembered as great communicators, orators, have typically had some, we might argue as Republicans or Democrats about the lasting value of those policies, but have had some success in the policy realm in where they've taken the country. And so it's actually that being remembered as a great communicator comes about because you were a successful president. So I'm skeptical of the notion that Obama's oratory alone will represent, some big headline or, in how we write about his presidency. I think, very difficult environment in which he governed, in which he achieved, significant but not, overwhelming policy achievements is more likely to be the assessment.
I actually would say it'll depend on who writes the history books. And that
Always.
Because, but again, people often look back on presidents and say, oh, he was just a genius, we didn't see it. Lincoln, for example. And then you take, again, somebody like Eisenhower, who got an incredible amount of stuff done, but got written out of the histories for various reasons over the last several decades. Nobody remembers him as a good communicator. So I actually think that it will depend on who writes the histories, but because of where he stands as the first African American president, as the person who stood in this really crucial moment in American history, he will be remembered for his political rhetoric, and people will study it, would be my thought.
I think I would agree with that. It doesn't make him a great president, make people see him as a great president alone, but I do think that it will be a part of his legacy because he is sort of tied to, well, the Affordable Care Act. That's a really big deal. I think it well could be, depending upon who is writing the history books, if they link that to these kinds of things, things that people thought might be impossible, then this rhetoric of hope and change and so forth that people might ridicule now might later on be fused together, but that will be historians who do that.
I would go back to this early point that I mentioned that of temperament and integrity, and I think that I'm not sure that these speeches have been terribly memorable for the long haul, but Obama is very erudite. He belongs to this pantheon of historians who had a sense of history, who had a sense of the mission of America, who had a vision that spoke to our historical experience across the ages. He injected, as Martin Luther King said, into the veins of civilization, an important theme and thread of coming to grips with our racial past. And that's a very powerful, I think, set of accomplishments. And in that sense, he will be, I think, remembered as greater than any individual speech or address that he gave.
Well, thank you all very, very much. So we do have some time for some questions, but let me underscore. Questions, please. And I am genuinely going to try and time folks. It's a new experiment. We're going to try it, see what happens. 30 seconds, maybe maximum of a minute, but we'd like to get to everyone if at all possible. So I do request that you keep your comments and questions brief. And actually, do you want to start over here, David?
Is this on? Just wondering, the president has about a little over 2 months left. A little over 2 months left in his presidency. Is there one thing that he could do by executive action that could significantly, dramatically, perhaps, affect his legacy?
I don't know, a recess appointment for Merrick Garland?
Yeah, I don't know either.
I mean, executive action is hard to, it's hard to do that much that's really lasting, at least if it's not going to be then challenged or quickly overturned. Often appointments, going back to the John Adams midnight appointments of judges, like this is an area of controversy. But
See how that turned out.
right. So I think his cards have mostly been played.
I'm not sure his card's been played in the sense that I'm with Annette. I think, Pollyanna though I am, I think the next several months are going to be rocky, and I'm glad he's in charge of managing the country during those rocky months.
Could, but won't.
Could he close Guantanamo,
Yeah.
for example? Well, he could do that, and I agree with you. He could do that, obviously, but he will not.
I mean, he could, let's say Donald Trump is elected. I think he could issue a lot of blanket pardons that would probably, in a sort of Gerald Ford sense, kind of be controversial at the time, but in the long run spare a lot of political acrimony. You know, that's where, like Heather, it's good that if Trump is elected, he'll be in charge for the next couple of months.
Should we go over here?
Since Republican obstructionism did so much prevent Obama's presidency from achieving its full potential, can you suggest changes to prevent his successors from suffering similar blockage? Solutions, please.
Did everyone hear the question?
I did, yes.
So,
It's a good question.
So the gentleman asked that since Republican obstructionism prevented President Obama from achieving much of what he had hoped to achieve, could a change be made to prevent the same fate befalling his successor?
Well, I think if the Senate changes hands, this will be important if Hillary Clinton is elected. And I would hope, and my friend, the Pollyanna here to my left, tells me there's reason to hope that if the Republican Party loses the presidency for the third election in a row, I keep thinking saner heads will need to prevail, or at least there'll be some effort to try to work through some of these difficulties.
Or the exact opposite could
But
happen.
others are saying that the exact opposite will occur. And I like to think that that's not so, but I don't know. We're going to find out.
I think
Maybe.
one sort of policy or structural change could be addressing the issue of gerrymandering, which probably, as people know, is sort of responsible for these kind of safe districts that in many states are predominantly Republican. Eric Holder and now President Obama himself have said they want to try to address this as a post-presidential challenge. That could conceivably, if the gerrymandering can be forced to be put on a less partisan political footing and more neutral as to how congressional districts are decided, you have more competition for which party is going to control congressional seats. That could conceivably make a difference in terms of obstructionism.
And that's really about what we were talking about before with the notion with Jefferson and the notion of people have to be involved in it. I mean, we have let this happen and people have allowed it to happen. So you end up with a system like this where partisanship can be roadblocked and nothing gets done.
I'd say gerrymandering and the filibuster. You know, those gerrymandering and the filibuster. Those seem to me imperative. And we can't do anything about gerrymandering until 2020 unless it goes through the courts. But the other piece of the gerrymandering that took place after 2010 was that it was financed very deliberately by the Republicans in something called Operation Red Map. And now that has been exposed, I think it's going to be. I think Democrats are going to recognize that they need to pour money into North Carolina, into the states that really went with gerrymandering, and make sure that they get the legislatures back, so that it's not going to happen again. So I mean, the problem is that's not going to happen until 2020.
And one quick thing on the filibuster. The problem with wanting to reform or do away with the filibuster, again, is if you do get President Trump, you're going to want that filibuster back. So a lot of this is where you stand depends on where you sit. And sometimes restraints on a powerful presidency, because we still do have a very powerful presidency, are a good thing, even if it hobbles a president whose policy preferences we may agree with.
Yeah.
Do you have a question over here?
Yes, I do. See if it works. One thing that hasn't been talked about too much is money. In 2008, President Obama said, well, you know what, I'm going to go head-to-head with the Republicans because using my new techniques, will be able to get more money than they will be able to get, and he was very successful with that. Therefore, Citizens United, became something that we're all talking about, but it was not a big problem in 2008 because we thought we being Democrats, that we could get more money than the Republicans. Republicans, on the other hand, took the long view, the Koch brothers and people like them, invested in this gerrymandering and doing all the organization of states, county by county, and built a structure which I think sort of allowed Mr. Trump to be successful, as repulsive as he is.
And the question?
Oh, the question is, discuss the place of money and funding in looking toward, did President Obama make a mistake by saying, you know what, I'm going to try to even the playing field and depend on my rhetoric to win, as opposed to just out-advertising, fundraising the Republicans?
You know, I may be an outlier. I know I'm an outlier here because I've done a lot of work on Citizens United. I don't worry about Citizens United. And I just heard somebody astonished. Because really rich people always find a way to game the system. So always, they always have, they always will. So what I look to is changing the makeup of the government to change the policies so we don't create those very rich people, that we get progressive taxation that will bring those very rich people back into the realm where they are not part of the multi-billion-dollar class. Now, Citizens United overturning that in the short term would be a good thing to help that. But until we find a way to stop this great divergence where you have this very small international group of multi-billionaires and the rest of us, they're always going to find a way.
I think the question sort of made a good point in talking about organization, that more important than money in politics is how it's used and the efforts that are put into organizing people, movements, strategies. There are political scientists will tell you, they've studied this, that how much money you spend on a campaign is not at all a predictor of who wins. I mean, just ask Jeb Bush. So, yes, obviously there are lots of examples where we can see money and the rich and corporations having too much access and influence, but it, in the past and in the present and the future, can be countered with good politics, good policy, good organization. There's millions of people out there who vote, and that matters in the end.
But the campaign finance reform really matters, I think. And, Obama raised a lot of money through super PACs and through big donors as well. It became a major problem when Hillary Clinton was doing it, but Obama also raised a lot of money this way, as have most candidates who have run for the presidency in the last many, many decades. And one of the people I studied in my recent book was Margaret Chase Smith, who refused to take any campaign contributions at all. When she ran for president in 1964, she would send back even a dollar bill with a note saying that she did not accept campaign contributions. Needless to say, she went down to resounding defeat. So, the infection of politics, and this was the thing that was fascinating about Trump, because when he first started running, and he said, I know the system, I know these people, I've bought them all off. I thought it was quite refreshing, actually. And it's a pivot from the days when Nelson Rockefeller was running for office, and there was this tremendous suspicion about all the wealth of the Rockefellers, which dates back, of course, to the late 19th century. So, we've got a serious problem in this regard in our political in modern political life, I think. I don't underestimate that at all.
Well, and I think that actually I would say that the problem is made ever more evident at the state and local level. I mean, we've heard that in this presidential election cycle, a lot of the money is being focused at the state and local level, and it's ever harder to find out who and where that money is coming from. But let's jump over here for another question, please.
Hi, I'm curious, we've had a lot of talk about what's gone on in the past. I guess that sort of makes sense as you're historians, but I'm curious as to what your opinions are. President Obama is still a relatively young man. What do you think he and his wife might have in store for them after they take a nice long vacation and begin their new lives?
Wow.
Well, I mean, I can only answer it. Well, what have past presidents done? Look, I mean, that's the kind of thing that's sort of a judgment of Obama and his own personal predilections. There have been some presidents who've been very involved in public life, in taking up, like Bill Clinton has, issues of international disease and so on through Clinton foundations. Others who have taken up policy issues. Others like George Bush, who's gone off to paint and stay out of the spotlight, which perhaps is a legitimate choice as well. I expect Obama to be in the first camp. He's going to have issues, what they are. He's talked about gerrymandering. I'm sure he'll find other issues in which he'll be outspoken, but he hasn't given too many hints.
No, he hasn't. He hasn't given beyond that. And there's some speculation about her. People, and I think it's sort of wishful thinking, that she might run for office or something, but I don't.
As she
see
has
that.
said,
There's
she's
no
not
way.
interested. But
I think they want out of this.
yeah.
And the minute that she did, she would suddenly, this unanimity of opinion
Right.
around Michelle Obama would, we would be hearing this chorus of horrors that.
Right.
You noticed I didn't say basket of deplorables, a chorus of horrors around her as well. The thing about the Obamas is that they're just so young and vigorous that it's, I suppose Bill Clinton was fairly young as well but most of the ex-presidents, have had their troubles and have not been that young. So it's a very interesting question. You've asked the wrong people, as they say of us, we predict the past. We're very good at that. So,
Well, I'm a little mindful of the time, and I want to be sure that we get to everyone who's at least at the microphones right now. So first I'll go over to this side, then I'll jump over there.
Thank you. I think we've missed a lot of opportunities with Obama. He's been a real gift to the country. He's had the ability to bring a lot of things together, both in his ethnicity, his internationalism, his race. And my question is, and words matter. So we describe Obama as the first African-American president. Why don't we describe the real Barack Obama, who's the first multi-race president?
Well, it's not me. Well, because we describe him that way because that's how he describes himself. Exactly. Yeah. That's his preference. He prefers to be called African American or black. And the plain fact is that, population geneticists have been doing a lot of work on African American people and find that the vast majority of African American people in the United States have European ancestry. So where do you stop with that? Blackness has never been defined as about blood. It's about association. And it's association with relatives, association with a particular kind of history. And he is multiracial. His children multiracial. They're multiracial in the way that lots of African Americans are. But the main thing is you call people what they want to call themselves. And he calls himself African American.
And I would simply add that there has not been a lack of discussion about his mother's influence, his white grandparents' influence. He's talked about it, a fair amount himself. So there's certainly a cognizance of his particular background that sort of informs our sense of who he is. It's not just as simple as one category or another.
And he's lived as an African American. Whatever the kinds of problems or issues that African Americans have are not going to be solved by him saying, "Oh no, that doesn't apply to me. Right. I'm mixed race." No, he has lived the life of an African American man.
And the story, it seems to me, of race in America, and in many respects, is a story. We can go back to Homer Plessy, that the treatment of Obama, the racism that he has experienced, has not been leavened by anybody saying, "Oh well, he's really half white or multiracial." there's been an enormous amount of racism that has surfaced here, and so I think that the idea of sort of embracing the notion of multi-racial origins and so forth runs up against the hardness of these categories as they have expressed themselves in American history, and the way that African Americans or anyone with any African blood were treated by law in this country for a very long time.
So I have the unfortunate task of telling us that we only have about 6 minutes left, but I want 2 minutes. Oh dear. Okay. Well, I did promise I'd go over here. So can we have a speed round, you think? Okay, go.
The underlying misogyny that has become apparent with the Clinton campaign and the underlying racism that has become more apparent with the Obama presidency. And thinking about how our society has developed a rising acceptance and celebration of the LGBTQ community while simultaneously revealing this very ugly side of ourselves. These issues have been there, but why are they surfacing now, and how do we then move forward? What's the hope for moving forward?
It's a good question, which I'm not sure is conducive to a speed round. But who wants to take a short crack at that?
Can I do a quick? I think one of the ways that the Republican Party has retained power is by dividing the world into us versus them. African Americans were the first thems, then young people against the Vietnam War were the thems, then women who wanted a role in American society were the thems, who were falsely, by the way, burning their bras. And when you get somebody like Mr. Trump now, what he's done is taken that language to an extreme and really revealed that this argument that somehow the thems were going to be taking our tax dollars has turned into the sheer vicious racism and sexism that you see today.
Would it really be a crime to take these last 2 questions? Okay. Okay. All right,
Yes.
so we'll do both
Yes.
of them at the stage. Okay.
Hello, I'd like to hear comments on President Obama's legacy with regard to foreign affairs.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah, we didn't talk about it.
we didn't talk about
My sense is that President Obama has been able to do all that he's done, marriage equality, being able to get the economy moving, being on the right side of gun control. In short, he's been on the right side of all the key issues that I think he needed to be. But he's been able to do this with half of Congress. And to me, what stands out to me is the fact that the other side of Congress has laid down and simply said no. That strikes me as treasonous. And it sets us up for what's coming forward should, and hopefully, Hillary Clinton wins. Because they've already talked about impeaching her even before she's been sworn in. I don't understand how that can happen.
It can't.
it. Can't.
That's the good news.
That's the good news.
I'll say just on the foreign policy, which I think we didn't get to, regrettably. That is one area where I think Obama's legacy is going to be kind of less unequivocally positive. I think he's achieved a lot of important things, particularly correcting for the Bush administration's kind of overly aggressive adventurism and interventionism. But I think, too, he overcorrected, and his main concern driving his foreign policy was domestic opinion, not to be getting bogged down in overseas adventures. And I think in Syria in particular, hard to know if it could have worked out differently. Historians don't like the what if questions. But certainly that is a very tragic situation that's occurred on his watch that will at least be part of the legacy for which he's assessed.
And he's continued many of the Bush policies, drone warfare, NSA, different types of things that were problematic from the Bush administration because nobody wants another 9/11. In that it's one thing to do that, just talk like that when you're a candidate, but when you're actually the president, that becomes a real, mania for people. So it's interesting because he has governed in that way as much more like his predecessors. He's taken the prerogatives of the president much more so than thinking about it in terms of party affiliation.
But he's really the first president since World War II to take on the fact that American moment when America could throw its weight around and do whatever, that most Americans nowadays grew up in and believe is the way the world was supposed to be, that was really only a very brief moment in the sweep of human history. And what he has done is he's returned us to the world before World War II, which was the real world where America was one of many powers jockeying for some sort of influence over things that matter to our country in other nations. And so that adjustment of we're not going to throw our weight around anymore, we're going to tiptoe and see what we can sneak out is, I think, the wave of the future, even though it's not popular because it looks wimpy. It's actually really smart.
I think he's tried to balance some attention to the human tragedies that we see unfolding in the world, in these terrible, terrible, ongoing atrocities, really, and the lack of American appetite for putting American soldiers in harm's way and continuing very long military engagements that seem to have no sure outcome or end, and also the desire to protect American national security so that there is not another 9/11. And any president who comes along is going to face all three of those things. It's a very hard thing to balance out.
Well, I'd like to just extend my sincere gratitude to all of you, to Annette Gordon-Reed, Ellen Fitzpatrick, David Greenberg, and Heather Cox Richardson. Thank you so very much. And thank you all for attending. Thank you, David, for the invitation as well.
And thank you, Megan. That was really, really good. Thank you.